I'm a piano player and a keyboard player, organist, all the key instruments, and I do a lot of jazz gigs, some commercial stuff, and any kind of accompaniment. So I don't close myself off stylistically to what I do, but I get a lot of work in smaller places, some regular jazz performance spaces here in Singapore, and some concert engagements. And I feel that in my life they keep on coming at a steady rate, which is a really wonderful situation. And to me, that's one of the great selling points of the jazz scene in Singapore. That for somebody who's trained in a little bit of a technical background in pop and jazz playing, that there's actually work around, and it might not be the kind of work that leads to stardom, but it's the kind of work that makes you a musician, makes you somebody that works in music, and the level of music here is actually quite high, I find. The jazz scene itself is very small, but there's a caliber of musicians here that operate at such high level technically, and also in terms of the knowledge, the grasp of the jazz language, that is very inspiring to be here, and I don't feel at all that I'm sort of in the top range. There's still a lot for me to work on, and I find that among the best Singaporean musicians that they are on a quest to become better and to collect more and more information and creative work in sort of in pursuit of their creative expression. And that's to a large extent what jazz is about, as is other serious music. So jazz is part of that, is one way musicians can engage in music as an art form. There are a handful of really good jazz instructors here, and I feel that while young people might not automatically go to those places where there's jazz happening in night spots, because it's not the kind of place where young people usually hang out, so they might not be exposed to the live jazz scene. But I think that once you decide you want to make use of this creative outlet or this creative discipline, that it can really work for a lot of musicians that are interested in playing. So I find that there's different, I would say, groups of people, sometimes more mature students who have experimented with music and are now at a point where they realize jazz can, acquiring the language of jazz can really enhance their creative output, and those are great students to have because they soak up everything. Then we have another group of people who don't know any music yet and don't have a background in the technicalities of piano or keyboards, but are not as inspired by the classical material as by other forms that they are used to listening to, such as maybe pop music, R&B, or jazz, or other popular forms of music. And so for those students, we can use the discipline of jazz to introduce them to a way of playing music playfully and with improvisational techniques. And then there's a group of students that already have classical skills, but feel intimidated by the kind of skills that we hone, such as improvisation or basically playing in time with chords and sort of making up the arrangement as we go. Jazz students might be intimidated about the skills that those classical students have, but a lot of the teachers here in Singapore know about this, because in the pursuit of our own sort of growth or search for excellence, we don't discount anything. So we practice rock if it's something challenging, if it's creatively helpful. We study classical to benefit from the long tradition of classical excellence and basically the training of the instrument. And so we have developed different ways of speaking to people who come from the classical background, and that I'm speaking for myself and other great, often young musicians here in Singapore. Some of them are more proficient in classical, but I have some experience also in dealing with the mindset of some good musicians that haven't had the chance to really dig into the jazz language, jazz repertoire, and soloing techniques. A good friend and wonderful pianist who is sort of a key figure in the jazz scene, has been for many years, Jeremy Montero, just posted an article online talking about how, sort of an inspired article, talking about how he noticed that jazz as a style is not prevalent in sort of the ratings, and we see sort of declining ratings as jazz as a popular art form. And he's reflecting on that and reflecting on how jazz musicians are really true what they like, despite these sort of numbers or impressions, cultural shifts. And I found it interesting that there was no, this ought to be like that or it ought to be like that, just recognizing what people are interested in. And I see also, like him, I see a lot of positivity in the entire scene. We realize that it is an art music, so we don't use the standards, the daily shifting standards of marketing terminology such as house music, R&B, urban, or whatever might crop up to talk about how music sells and in what numbers. And I feel that there's a move as the music industry shifts and people download, and people, what now the emerging market is subscriptions that might come with the next phone contract subscription. These things are actually primed to bring more alternative music to the forefront of people's consciousness. So what's happening is that alternative rock, or people's living room version of pop music, or jazz performances, or classical performances are now promoted in a different way because they're part of a subscription package and just make up an alternative of what people can listen to. And in the in this aspect, in the emerging technologies and emerging cultural trends, I feel very encouraged about survival of jazz. We have to also look at jazz not only as a popular art form, but as also as a pursuit that musicians might want to take once they decide to be serious about the instrument. So it is not just the viewpoint of the consumer, but also the viewpoint of the creative practitioner that we consider. And then under those aspects, I think it looks positive. Got into jazz earlier. I come from the same background as a lot of young people come from. Somebody that learns maybe songs as a child and has an affinity for music, just melodies, regardless of style, then gets into radio music, music that we hear in the day, and maybe develops a taste for a specific group, older group or a newer group, and that's what happened to me. I got into the Beatles, some other artists before, and I started listening more carefully. And this careful listening brought me to blues recordings, where I was interested by the emotional response I had and what my body would do as I was listening to it. So sort of a visceral response to the music. And as you look for formal beauty, you sometimes come across those more jazzy things. Of course, the classical music as well is full of it, but I find that jazz in particular also has the advantage of tapping into that rhythmical response that comes from the sort of adherence to a steady beat in jazz, and that it's another form of engaging with the music it seemed very natural to me, and I was very much drawn to it. There's also an emotional richness of the music, as it sometimes comes from people that really need to express themselves, and you get that first-hand expression, while in classical music it is the creative output and sort of the soul-searching of the composer, filtered through the organizational factor of the editor of the sheet music, and then maybe the creative input of the interpreter. And so jazz has a lot to give as an immediate art form. I also find human ingenuity and spirit represented in free flow improvisation. And that's something that comes after reflecting, after finding particular recordings that you repeat over and over again, just for the joy of listening. Jazz is a language, and if I teach a child, I wouldn't wait until a child reaches a word count of 2,000 before I start having a conversation with the child. But we try to engage the child seriously as a one-to-one person conversation with the vocabulary that the child has. And there's ways to make music on that level. Just gaining technical strength to one degree, and maybe as one train of instruction, and another train of instruction being helping the student to use that material to express themselves musically. Now at that point we don't put a name jazz to it. It's within the jazz tradition, but we don't care what people call it. That is more of a marketing term again, and we're just interested in good music. And conversely, what happens sometimes is that sometimes I find students that want to limit themselves because they're saying, I'm into Justin Bieber, or I'm into Justin Timberlake, or any other fantastic musician, John Mayer being one of them. These people have found ways of making music on a high creative level without using too many chords. Without going outside of conventional chord changes and harmonic structures. A person that pursues that might think, oh, my playing is good enough to play A7, E7, and D7. Why should I study any further? So I can take that same, on the same token, I can advocate for excellence, because I can see that the real heroes of all of these kinds of music don't limit themselves to the excellence in those fields. So they often get really nerdy about their instruments at some points of their lives and spend hours figuring out how all this is put together, how the classical repertoire that is relevant for their instrument, what is it like to attain that and to make it part of the repertoire of the student. And you find that the same the same can be said for jazz material. So as a jazz musician, all that material is part of my expression, because it is at the end of the day, I want my music to reflect reality as I understand it, and these other forms of music are part of the reality. High level musicians